So this next panel is a little bit of a change of pace in two ways. The first is that we're kind of stepping back out to the federal level from the state level, though there are probably some lessons that can be learned at the state level as well. And the second thing is that, unlike talking about what has been done, what is being done, or what we're struggling to do, what we're hoping with this panel is to really talk about what could be done. So a disclaimer that I'd like to make up front is, like, for this session, we're asking myself and our other panelists to kind of think about what the policies might be that could change to deal with this epidemic. And to that end, it's going to be a lot of hypotheticals. And so it's not necessarily the policy agenda of any of our organizations, though we might touch on some of those things too. But the other thing that I want us to think about is, and I do talk about this a decent amount, but I came of age and came out in 1989 in New York City during the height of the AIDS, the initial wave of the AIDS epidemic. And there was that moment. In that moment, it was a death sentence for everyone that got it. There was very little government investment or involvement in it. People were fighting every day to just get any action. And I think at that point, it was impossible to imagine that within a decade, you would have protease inhibitors and you would have it becoming more of a chronic illness. And I think in some ways it was people who were visionary, and in some way people who were not necessarily, no shade, gentlemen, who were not experts, but who were survivors and advocates who thought outside of what was deemed possible by the powers that be. So that's something that I would really like for C. diff and for antibiotic-resistant and healthcare-associated infections, is for the people who've been impacted by them to really start thinking big and thinking outside the box. I really appreciated what Janet was saying earlier and what Cliff was saying earlier. Like, the fact that we have state health departments that have no investment in this area is just a complete tragedy. And I think that there are lots of ways that we could, especially in the age of social media, be thinking about how we call that out. Like, if you go to the next gubernatorial town hall in your state and you say, X number of people die of this disease every year and you don't invest in the state health department, what are you going to do about that? There are ways to learn from some of the more advocacy-oriented groups of the past, like ACT UP and Women's Health Action Mobilization. I'm not suggesting you chain yourself to anything or anyone, but but it's definitely something that we should be thinking about. Like, how are we capturing people's attention? And the other thing that I really would like for us to all just keep in mind is that, it came up a lot with Tony talking, and it's kind of been this recurring theme throughout the day, which is that it's not going to be easy. It's really not going to be easy. We are going to have to be pestering and knocking and pushing and, pushing our legislators and pushing the regulators and pushing the policymakers and pushing our friends. There are many of us in this room who are all going to the same endpoint. We may not always agree on how to get there. And so we might have to have some conflicts, but also keep in mind that we're all moving in we all want the same outcome. My husband's like, why isn't he like that at home? He wants everything his way. So I'm actually really delighted to have these three gentlemen with me. I'm actually kind of aghast that I convened a manel, which is an all-male panel. It's amazing. But I'm going to go sit there and be gay, so it's, me and Paul can be a little diversity here. So I let them each introduce themselves, and they're each going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to sort of open up for more of a discussion and questions. And I'd also love for the advocates and other people in the room to kind of, at that point, talk through what you think we should be doing or what you'd like to see. So, Paul, should we turn it over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kristen. Afternoon, everybody. I know it's been a long day, but you guys have a very exciting agenda, it looks like, and this is a wonderful springboard, I think, to the last session with the training and thinking about lobbying day. A little bit of background about myself. I'm currently an attorney at a firm called Foley Hoag. It's a Boston-based firm working on federal government affairs, things like FDA issues, NIH, biomedical research, My background is I actually spent a significant portion of my adult life working on Capitol Hill. I was working for Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, and God bless you. I feel the same way every day. I don't know if you ever have this experience of looking back and realizing you may have had your best job, and that was the one that you already had. That's generally, and I love what I do, but that's generally how I feel about that experience. And then I worked also for Congressman Henry Waxman of California, who was on the Committee of Jurisdiction, working on FDA and NIH issues for them. And the fact that you're here preparing and getting ready to engage the staff and members on your issues, on C. diff, on CDI, I think is really inspiring. I think as a former staffer, I can tell you I've had good and bad meetings with patient groups. We had very confrontational ones. We also have very engaging ones. But I can tell you that the fact that you're actually going to go into the half-hour meeting with them, and hopefully it's more closer to a half hour instead of the 20 minutes where they're late or you get lost or you spend too much time introducing yourselves, that you are holding their feet to the fire. And I think the notion that a significant proportion of those members and staff are totally new to their jobs. So a lot of these members don't know where the bathrooms are in the Cannon House office building. You guys are professionals in a way that maybe even exceeds in some ways their ability to be members and staff. So part of your job is to train them, I think, to apprehend and understand why patient perspectives are important, how you are deeply involved. You're not just somebody who just showed up, in D.C. for a half hour to meet with them. You have an existing relationship, a set of network of relationships. You have extensive experience with surveillance issues, with treatment issues, with quality of care issues. These are very, very deep wells that you can draw on, including your personal and familial histories. And so if the staff and members don't treat you with respect, you should actually challenge them on that because you are entitled to that. They work for you. And so, I'm not at all talking about what I was going to talk about in relation to federal policy, but, I think that you guys should absolutely walk with your heads very held up high and expect that the staff and members will give you their undivided attention. When they start looking to their smartphones under the table, that's not a good meeting, right? But you can actually say, we'd love it if you could just put that down for a second. We understand you're very busy, that, you have extraordinary commitments and challenges to your schedule, but, we came all the way from X, and, we represent the following kinds of families, and we just need to have your focus for just a little bit of time to explain why these issues are important. And don't bury the lead. When you do those meetings, start off, explain exactly why you're there, and then tell them exactly what you need from them. And don't leave without a follow-up. If you just have the meeting and you have a wonderful meeting, you talk to them and it's a very engaging conversation. We're so glad we met you. Boy, we're so glad you came in. You shake hands, you have the leave-behinds in their hands, and you leave. And you realize there's nothing else to be said. You should always leave with something to say like, well, we're going to follow up with you in a week or two, or we hope you can actually talk to your member about co-sponsorship of that bill, or, please look to the appropriation request. The president's budget is, this far down where it should be, or the professional judgment estimate for the appropriations this year should be actually up here. We're going to call you and follow up with you. Those are, that's the meat of continuing the conversation, maintaining that dialogue, and building the relationship with that member and staff. Not only having the one good meeting, but it's the first step in a long journey with them. Even if they may not want to be on that journey with you, that's their job. So I can't remember what I was going to talk about. Really? I remember. So Christian actually said, what could be done? So set aside all the all that logistical that kind of advice is that's you already know that. I think you probably internalized a lot of that. What could be done? I did want to use one example. I think of things that we did while I was working on the Hill, and also when I was lobbying outside off the Hill for private clients. But you should absolutely blue sky stuff and look to what does federal policy look like? What are the investments? Where are the gaps? And develop what should be, I think, a coherent framework for where it should be. It's very challenging in this fiscal environment to say it should be $100 million additional annually for the following purposes. But as Christian had said, when the HIV epidemic started, it was literally small clusters of clinicians, community organizers, patients, individuals in the community who made substantial dramatic changes happen. We talk a little bit about how FDA regulates this space. The FDA regulates this space because of the historic experiences that patients like yourselves brought to the agency and got Congress to change the law, to impose differences in regulations, to take the best in leading science and the flexibility in regs and make that happen. You can always do what you did yesterday, but the challenge is to get the agency and institutions like that to change. And that, I think, is really at the heart of patient experience. It was one that was only happening because folks like yourselves came up every year, every quarter, followed up with members and staff and made that happen. That's one example, I think. It's a pertinent example because, today there is a program called the Ryan-White Care Act, which is $2 billion a year in HIV treatment and care, not in prevention, but in treatment and care, which didn't exist before 1992. And it now exists and is a thriving enterprise where states, community organizations are all engaged, patients care deeply about this, and they lobby intensely every year. And that platform didn't exist before patients made that happen. Another example, I think, in relation to CDI and multi-drug resistant strains and infections, there is a law called the GAIN Act, the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act, which was part of a FDA user fee reauthorization a few years ago. But that law would actually double down and increase exclusivities for certain qualifying antibiotics that are intended to treat really tough infections. That doubling down of an exclusivity is almost unheard of when you think about the reputation of drug companies. And we have folks who represent and work for drug companies here, but they're not their favorite constituency right now in Congress or in the administration right now for obvious reasons. And yet, at that time, we were able to find a great public health case for increasing exclusivity for these specific drugs, for these specific companies willing to invest in this space. And that started as a blank sheet of paper. It was literally an engagement of multiple groups, patient groups, IDSA, manufacturers, what would work to increase investment and get more companies involved in the space. And we literally started with a whiteboard in an exercise like this, thinking about what would work best. So, getting those kinds of laws from the drafting table to the president's desk for signing is absolutely a concrete exercise. It happens every day in every congressional session, and you guys are the architects of that success.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you want to get up or do you want to stay here?
Totally off topic.
I'm sorry. Is it on?
Can you hear me? No.
There's a... Yeah, can you hear me?
Hi, my name is Greg Fluitt. I'm with Readmissions, which is now part of Fairing. I think some of you may know Readmissions from prior Peggy Lewis Foundation events. I've worked with the company about 2.5 years. In my role, I work both on some of our policy initiatives. I also work with the Fairing group and kind of starting to look at the overall patient need and how to start meeting that demand, and as well as partnering with other organizations. And before working at Treebiotics, I've spent my healthcare career really working with companies to bring novel, game-changing technologies to market. That's I've worked with a lot of early-stage startup companies and companies that have technologies or treatments that generally are pretty different. They're not just iterative improvements. And I think Treebiotics, and really looking at this next generation of creating a microbiota transplant, embodies a lot of that. And the microbiome opportunity, to me, I think is fascinating. And the C. diff need is something that you guys have expressed better than anything I could ever do. I think the strength of what patient advocacy brings is incredibly important. And you guys have an amazing ability to make a lasting impression, not just with everyone in this room, but with the folks you'll be meeting with tomorrow. And that voice, I can't stress enough how important that is. It really can make change. And so in some of kind of thinking about this event, I wanted to echo a little bit of what was said, that one is I think this can be a daunting process. I've been involved myself in doing some lobbying work, and sometimes you feel like you're beating your head against the wall and you don't see a lot of change, but it's that cumulative drip effect over time, which does make change. And I think the other thing that struck me about working in the C. diff space is how prevalent C. diff survivors really are. I've had the experience of a family member of mine going through recurrent C. diff and eventually getting treated through a family stool donor microbiota transplant. And And I've been in so many meetings where you have a group of 4 to 8 people in a room, and you ask them, you start talking about C. diff, and they go, yeah, my daughter or my aunt or my mother had C. diff. And I've worked in a lot of different disease areas. I've never seen that type of commonality of people with that type of association. So kind of as Tony was saying, where you shrink that down, the world down into 1 to 2 degrees of separation. I think you have an opportunity to do that in some of the meetings tomorrow too. Ask them who they know that's had C. diff, and I'd be surprised if you didn't run into a few people tomorrow that do, or have had family members that have. So, in terms of the policy piece, there's a lot of good asks. I think one thing is it is good to have kind of a clear ask of what you would like to see them do. I think with some of the work by Cliff McDonald showing some of the statistics, it's impressive to see that we're starting to see a little bit of a change in that. But more reporting, I think, is a benefit. I think from some of what Christian has said, I think there is a lot of underreporting of this disease. While we're getting good reporting from the hospital systems, a lot of the community acquired goes unreported. So this is a much bigger population than what you just see in the top line data. I think the CDC is doing great work trying to aggregate a lot of that, but there's a significant issue out there. And so I wish you the best in your work, not just tomorrow, but as things progress. And if there's anything we can do to work with you more, I'd be happy to try and help facilitate that.
Dr. Atkinson, do you want to? He has a few slides. And then when he's done, I'm going to grill all 3 of them.
Okay. Everybody in this room knows the story of C. diff. And my role in coming to you today is to tell you the story of penicillin allergy and how the two are related to one another, if you haven't already heard this before. I'm Frank Atkinson. I work down the road at Johns Hopkins University, where I've been an academic faculty member in allergy immunology for my entire career. And I developed in medical school an interest in penicillin allergy and have spent the last 50 years trying to bring to market and to availability the necessary diagnostic reagents for determining who is at risk for having serious allergic reactions to penicillin. So let me, and more recently, as you'll see by the, go back, let me see. The second title there, more recently I've been involved with a small company that actually just has 4 originators in it, 4 physicians who, all of whom are interested in penicillin allergy, and have put together a small company to preserve one of the reagents and to bring to market other necessary reagents for testing for penicillin allergy. So what about the penicillin allergy story? So here it is in brief. Penicillin, if you don't already know it, is the most highly allergenic of our antibiotics and is the most common cause of drug allergy in general. And about 10% of the U.S. population, so we're talking about 30-plus million Americans, report having had a bad experience with penicillin treatments that's led them to be labeled in their medical record as allergic to penicillin. And most of these patients who are labeled as allergic to penicillin never receive not only penicillin, but the whole family of penicillin antibiotics, which is 25 or so antibiotics. Because most antibiotics in this country are administered by primary care physicians, not by infectious disease or allergists who might be able to be more subtle in the interpretation of some of the histories provided. The concern here, the reason why it doesn't happen in a system like ours where medical legal liability is an issue, is concern that the most serious types of allergic reactions to penicillin, namely anaphylaxis or a life-threatening allergic reaction, might occur if a patient who had a previous problem with penicillin was given the drug again. And yet we know from studies over my career time, the last 50 years, that allergy to drugs that cause this type of serious allergic reaction are caused by an allergic antibody that's called IgE, and that antibody declines if you don't become recurrently exposed to penicillin products. It's true for all allergies in general. And also many reactions don't involve this kind of antibody. They're simple rashes that occur late in the course of treatment, and yet they get patients labeled as allergic to penicillin. So the bottom line that's come from many studies now over the years is that when evaluated by skin testing, which can find this allergic antibody that's really important, the IgE antibody, fewer than 1% of the U.S. population is truly allergic to penicillin. That is, as evidenced by having positive skin tests. So next slide, here we go. What are the medical consequences of this? Well, as you might imagine, it means that a lot of antibiotics are denied to more than 30 million Americans who are labeled as allergic to penicillin, only about 5% of whom are really allergic. And oftentimes this means choosing a suboptimal antibiotic therapy and therefore getting a poorer outcome. And it's been shown that these alternative antibiotics, many of which are bacteriostatic rather than bactericidal, like the penicillin family, result in the emergence of resistant organisms, including C. diff. And two large epidemiologic studies that are summarized here show you the increased incidence of antimicrobial resistance in terms of C. diff in the first column there, MRSA in the second, and vancomycin-resistant enterococcus in the third. That when you have a label of penicillin allergy on your record, you are much more likely to get infected with these organisms and therefore have to be not only have these resistant or potentially resistant organisms infect you, but you also have many reductions in the ability to treat them properly. So that leads to some good news and some bad news. The good news is that allergists know how to deal with this problem. If we could see 30 million Americans in consecutive periods and evaluate them with skin testing, we can pick out the 1% of the population that's truly allergic and delabel the rest of them. The bad news is that this has not happened, and there are several reasons for that. First is that one of the skin testing reagents that's required is penicillin G, as a minor determinant antigen is penicillin G, and it's not available in skin testing concentration, so it's a big problem to make dilutions in the office and in the hospital to do the appropriate skin testing. And because we don't have all of the appropriate skin testing reagents, you have to essentially do an oral challenge at the end of the skin testing with the two reagents that are available to be absolutely sure the patient's not sensitive. And this whole procedure takes 2 to 3 hours. So allergists, many of whom are not really willing to do that because it's unmanageable in a practice to take 2 or 3 hours to do a simple solution like this. And in addition, allergists have been waiting since one of the early papers that my colleagues and I published back in 1970 suggested that you needed these minor determinant allergens in order to be confident in the results. And those are not yet available. So what happened in 2013 is the formation of a small company that I mentioned called AllerQuest. And we were successful in bringing back to market one of the major determinant allergens for skin testing. And our objective since then has been to bring the rest of these minor determinants to the availability of allergists, but not only allergists, but other knowledgeable and well-trained physicians in infectious disease specialists and even nurse practitioners and pharmacists in some hospitals, to be able to do definitive skin testing with a little kit, and then based on that not have to do the oral challenge. So it means that from 3 hours you're down to a practical 30-minute type of 45-minute type of test, which makes it much more possible to sizably address this problem with millions of Americans who need it. And we finished a clinical trial of 455 patients who were histories of serious allergic reactions to penicillin, and showed that when this little kit of skin test is negative, that patients will invariably tolerate penicillin and therefore can be delabeled with regard to penicillin allergy. And we're now we have taken to the FDA an application to license this little kit and make it available to the medical profession, which we hope will lead to some good news, as shown on the next slide here. If we can get FDA approval, and our product, even though it's a simple skin test that doesn't really have any issues of safety, and it's been long known to be effective, is being treated like a drug. So the regulatory requirements are very strict and stiff, and 2 other companies have failed to bring this to fruition in the past, largely because there's no revenue stream that really can warrant the expenses necessary to take a product like this through the process. If we can do this, however, successfully, and hospitals and the national antibiotic stewardship efforts are now endorsing the notion that this is an important thing to do, then we can end up delabeling or taking away from their medical records the label of penicillin allergy for millions and millions of Americans, and opening up their ability to use other antibiotics, and hopefully reducing, therefore, by virtue of eliminating a higher rate of use of alternative antibiotics, the emergence of resistant organisms in the future, and hence reducing, hopefully, the prevalence of disorders like C. diff. So we don't need that. That's an alternative slide, I think. I leave you with that as a possibility for an indirect way of affecting the C. diff and other resistant organism epidemic that we have in the country, and we hope to be successful with this. We have overcome many administrative and regulatory requirements to get this far, and we're hoping to be able to provide this opportunity for delabeling, which we think is one indirect way in which this epidemic can be addressed, and have many other positive benefits for personal care as well.
Thank you. So as promised, now I'm going to ask some very troubling questions. So one of the things that I'd be curious to hear from both Greg and Paul is we have had a lot of progress when it comes to the federal government investment in developing new antibiotics. There are other companies here that have benefited from that or are currently benefiting from that for fast track designation and other things. Do you have a sense of what that might look like or could look like in ways that would spur more microbiome type therapeutics? Like if that was, like, could we have a similar policy set for that?
Well, one of the things that we're working with some of the lobbying groups on, so we're a member of the Bio-AMR group, which is a antimicrobial resistant working group, and one of the things is to be able to broaden the inclusion criteria for what are novel therapies that would be incentivized under some of the infectious disease programs beyond just antibiotics. I think one of the things that struck me learning about C. diff is that the primary treatment is also the primary risk factor, and so there is a lot of work given the growing recognition of the risks of antimicrobial resistance to fuel more antibiotic research, but it's a narrow definition. And so one of the things is to make sure that that definition includes biologics, therapeutics, microbiota-based technologies. Look at other treatment mechanisms for infectious disease beyond just antibiotics. And that simple change alone can really help broaden just the innovation across a wide variety of platforms.
Do anything to add?
Yeah, I would only add, if you were to add biological products to the scope of products eligible to be qualified infectious disease products, QIDPs under the GAIN Act, and double down on that exclusivity and hopefully bring new companies, investors, investigators, clinicians into the marketplace with an interest in pursuing those therapies, that would be a small change to an existing law that has a track record. We can point to the number of new sponsors, the number of new drugs, and that incrementalism, I think, is really important. I think, I can't remember who it was, might have Christian, you might have said, like, basically, if you can achieve 10% of what you need to do in this session of Congress, my old boss, Senator Kennedy, used to say, take it and then start working on the next step. It's just, one form of incrementalism. And I think that's an important and very feasible legislative proposal that could hopefully get enacted into law this Congress. And that would, I think, make a big difference in terms of signaling to investors and to investigators.
And along that same line, and I would propose this to you, to Dr. Atkinson, in terms of the situation that your company's in, what can the advocates in this room, are there specific things that they should be asking members of Congress? Should they be reaching out to folks at FDA? No, don't worry, the guys here from the FDA, we're not going to corner you in the bathroom after this. But you know what I'm saying? Should they be reaching out to them or encouraging people on the Senate Health Committee that are in the FDA subcommittee? Should those be, how can we sort of start to light a fire under them to make some of these policy changes?
Well, I would say that generalizing from what I told about the penicillin allergy story, just in general support of more precise antimicrobial stewardship, we have been to the Hill to advocate in favor of increased government support for drug allergy, antibiotic allergy testing of other types as well, because we know that the story with penicillin is not unique, that studies with provocational challenge of patients who are labeled as allergic to other antibiotics, for example, when patients are brought back and challenged, excluding the very severe cases, that 85% of them are tolerant. So that if we had other tests for antibiotic allergy, we could even further broaden the options for more precise use of antimicrobials. And that is something that the NIH and the FDA can support as well.
Now I'm going to put Greg on the spot. So you're representing one of the companies that's part of the Microbiome Therapeutic Innovation Group. We've got antibiotics. We have new ones. We've had some that have been approved recently. We don't yet have a microbiome therapy besides arguably sort of fecal transplant done by a doctor or done through a stool bank. What, and I've always thought of that to myself as sort of being an intermediary step till we get to the promised land of being able to do this in a more sophisticated way. No shade to the stool banks. What do we need to do to get there? What are the obstacles that are sort of challenging? And Paul, you might speak on this too, in terms of the broader group of companies who are looking to bring this to the fore?
Yeah, great question. I think kind of going back to thinking about the steps, it's a series of events that have to occur to really make these therapies broadly accessible. The first and foremost is FDA approval, and not just for the FDA approval's sake, but that's really a door opener to getting broad insurance coverage. And I think when you look at the needs of the patient population, the first thing is they need to have these treatments covered by the insurance companies. And if there isn't good insurance coverage, it's never going to be that accessible for patients broadly, and both Medicare as well as the commercial payers and Medicaid. And so, to get there, you have to have really high-level clinical data to support that decision. Insurance companies are loath to approve drugs that either aren't approved or don't have high-quality data associated with them. So that's where we are now, is building that data set for Treebiotics. And was everyone able to hear me on? So, the data is a foundation for what actually opens the doors for patients to get broader access to these drugs. And this is, as big as of a population we've heard, this is actually a relatively challenging patient population to enroll for clinical studies. Specifically, we're focusing on recurrent C. diff. And so, there's about 500,000 C. diff infections a year. About, depending on what data you look at, between 125 and 185,000 are recurrent C. diff infections. And so that's technically an orphan disease, which means, it's a fairly low disease population. Sounds like it's a lot of patients when you're having to deal with it, but, in the grand scheme of things, it's ranked as an orphan disease. And it really is still being treated largely outside of specialty care. So, GIs and IDs are very involved in seeing these patients, but they're seeing a minority of the patients. And a lot of family practice, primary care groups aren't involved in clinical research that much. It tends to be more among specialties. So there's a little bit of a challenge in really getting these patients exposed to the ability to enroll in these clinical trials. So from a patient advocacy standpoint, I know the Peggy Lillis Foundation has all the clinical trials on the website. Those are great resources, making patients aware that there are those options. That's an important step just to make sure that there's, if people are looking for non-antibiotic treatments, that they know what all their options are.
So we have like 10 minutes or so left. I think it would be great to open. Christina Furman apparently has a question, everybody. She's been the first out of the gate every time. She's polishing her apple here right at the front of the stage.
This is just so exciting to have all these brains around here, I have a question for Dr. Atkinson. Did I say it right?
I think so.
Your pre-pen, that's incredibly exciting. I am labeled penicillin allergy, as is my little one, and we both have had recurrent C. diff infections. And so I'm very interested in this for all of us. And so I'm wondering, once that gets approved, because I'm sure it will then the rash just be labeled as a side effect? And my second question is, if in the interim someone like me who is labeled a penicillin allergy does need antibiotics and prefers to try it again, are there any protocols where once you're labeled you can't try it until you're tested, or just wondering about that?
Well, let me try to answer that briefly because it's complicated. There are more than one type of allergic reaction to penicillin, and the most common is the one you've mentioned, which is a late onset rash, which is caused by not an allergic antibody but by the T lymphocyte part of the immune system. And yet those rashes, except for the very small few of them that go on to produce skin scalding type syndromes, are benign and go away promptly when the drug is readministered. And those rashes occur in 3 to 10% of standard courses of penicillin. So every time anyone in this room takes penicillin, they have a 3 to 10% chance of developing one of these rashes. But if you know that's going to be the outcome, that's not a contraindication to using penicillin if you have a serious infection for which penicillin is the drug of choice.
Great. Tony?
This is for Dr. Atkinson again. Mono and amoxicillin rash. Are you considered allergic to penicillin then? Because my son had mono, and he was taking amoxicillin at the time, and he was covered head to toe. He looked like an orange.
Right.
And he was pretty bad. His fevers was 106, and then they said forever he's going to be allergic, but we've read different.
Right. So still don't understand the association between amoxicillin and EB virus infection and why the rash rate is so high. But again, it's thought to be from the T lymphocyte part of the system. And what I think most physicians would do now is you might stay away from amoxicillin, but all the other penicillins are going to be available to you. So you shouldn't really be compromised in terms of being able to treat accurately infections if you just can't take amoxicillin.
I feel like asking all the questions about allergies I might have. So, Dr. Atkinson.
I don't know if this is too broad of a thing to bring up on Lobby Day, but one of the things that happened in my sister's case was on her death certificate, nowhere is there C. diff. Nowhere. They have sepsis. They have
It says that she died. I usually show my mother's death certificate when I speak. That always gets the party started. But yes, it says that her immediate cause of death was disseminated intravascular coagulopathy, brought on by septic shock. But it doesn't say the the cause, the bacteria, and from just talking to the people that we know who've lost a loved one to sepsis, it got weird. I thought I was going to start singing. But what we've found is that, and with all due respect to Cliff's presentation earlier, I actually think that death certificates are an incredibly unreliable source of data at this point because there's very little uniformity, there's very little training on how to fill them out. But so I think, is that something that we should be pursuing, do you think, in terms of getting there to be more scrutiny and more of a sort of federal or national standard for how that happens? And also them being reimbursed properly, because nobody wants to fill them out because you don't make any money doing it.
Yeah, if I were to put my old staff hat on, I'd want to know, so who sets those standards? What is it medical societies? Is it state boards? Is it state government? Is it a federal standard? Does CDC have any say on this? It obviously impacts on surveillance, right, and on your epidemiology and the knowledge you have about the incident. So, of course, it's absolutely a material question. And then there's this whole constellation of things that you'd want to know, and where are the levers to actually affect a change to that? Is it a model state law? Is it something that Congress can do? Is it oversight? So yeah, I think that's an excellent starting point.
Yeah, just in general, so the CDC does do a lot of guidance on this stuff that you can actually go look it up, but the CDC is not an enforcement organization. The CDC can't make anybody do anything. And as somebody who's been doing this work now for nearly 9 years, going to places and hearing other patient advocates yell at the CDC for not changing the way that people do healthcare is just it's not a good use of your time. They don't make those policies. Janet, did you have something you wanted to ask or say?
So I just wanted to point out that in our initiative, the Vital Records Association is part of that, and this issue around completing death certificates in detail is huge, and public health deals with this all the time. And one of the things that people would like to invest in would be a query process back, so that when it's being reviewed, you could go back and ask for additional details. Because once those get submitted, and then people don't want to go back and fill them out, and then it's 3 months later, and you lose the ability to gather some of that information. So I think the more that you can talk about how it's a problem to be able to count things consistently, and that's the perfect example, but there's the whole host of other things that are public health surveillance challenges. And if we could look at how we can really improve that, and there are a lot of good ideas around how to get there, I think that's a great example.
I'm very excited about the initiative that CSTE and something that we're actually going to be talking to the lawmakers about tomorrow, and there'll probably be more work for us coming down the pike there too. But something I want to, we grew up poor. I think a lot of you know that. My mom didn't have any money. We were on welfare when I was a kid. And so when Cliff was doing this slide earlier about Ohio, and they spent $2 million or $2.5 million, and it was all this money. It's not a lot of money when you're talking about an entire state's budget. And it's not a lot of money. The fact that CSTE wants $1 billion to be invested over 10 years by the federal government in updating all of these vital public health information systems, that is a rounding error in the federal budget. And so you have to not only go in there tomorrow and be confident, but you have to go in there and say, if they say, well, how will we pay for it? You say, wherever you find the money for wars. Because they never have trouble passing money for wars. And this is a war that's happening. More people will die from C. diff this year than will die from a terrorist attack or anything else like that. So they can find the money to make this happen if you push them to do it. Sorry. And no one here else endorses that statement. Or maybe they do. But it is, you're an average person, you think $1 billion, oh my God, that's a horrifying number. It's nothing to, when you're talking about a $13 or $14 trillion budget is the one that Trump submitted that won't get passed. But you're talking in the trillions. And when you're looking at even a state budget, $2 million is nothing in most states' budgets. And the fact that, look at what they're spending $2 million on that they could have spent on public health and that be what you're saying. So you know what? We'd like you to travel in less private jets, less Ubers, and give the money to public health. Sorry, I'm ranting. Did Jackie have a question?
Yeah, when you're talking about death certificates.
Is it on?
Hello? Nope.
It's not on.
I'm not talking loud enough.
You're going to have a microphone training after this.
When my brother passed away, the coroner actually called me and asked about the medications he took. He was very involved in trying to decide, was the heart attack from medications he took, or it was just a heart attack. So when he did that, I felt, wow, that's amazing, that he wanted to know who my brother was before he put what was on the death certificate. So is that something that the family could actually bring all of the medical records and say, I want to sit down with the coroner and talk to him about this? And I believe that this started with C. diff, but they died of sepsis. Could we not just do that on our own, or bring that to awareness through Peggy Lillis?
So that is actually technically part of our Make C. diff Count campaign. Did you have a question, or were you going to answer that?
I was going to just actually, my brother passed away, not from C. diff or sepsis, but he was part of the opioid epidemic. And it took me 6 months, because they just had that he died of a heart attack, and it took about 6 months to add that he was part of an overdose. But you can, and I want to add that another thing, that only 10% of bodies are ever autopsied.
Used to be 50%.
Yeah.
It has declined dramatically in the past 20
declined
30
dramatically.
years.
And the other thing that I wanted to add about, you can get them to change it. I know in Michigan I got them to change his death certificate. And if in hospitals, a lot of the doctors don't fill out the death certificate, or they fill out part of it, and then they have interns or nurses fill out the rest of it, and by the time it gets to them, there's about 60 forms that get filled out. So I think it's great that you guys are bringing this up, because it's not just C. diff and sepsis, but it's a lot of things that are not being collected systematic.
And I think as you're looking at what levers you can pull on, too, some of it is trying to figure out what's going to cause a lot of reaction from how the metrics get implemented. And I'm not familiar with the tracking that goes on with the cause of death and how that influences what gets funded or what gets researched. But I do know one of the things that struck me when I came across this just in the last month or so was there's a lot of recurrence in C. diff. That's a given. And there's a lot of quality metrics in the hospitals now for healthcare-associated infections, and if they don't meet certain standards, their reimbursement can get hurt. They also separately track readmissions, and about 50% of recurrent C. diff patients will get readmitted to the hospital. But that's neither a healthcare-associated infection, and if it's outside that, because they got it in the community setting now, maybe community-associated. So it doesn't hurt that quality metric of the hospital. And it's also not one of the measures that triggers a readmission that gets tracked. So there's 6 different disease states like congestive heart failure and some others. If you have a readmission within a window of time, there's a negative quality impact. And so to me, it's kind of like this black hole in the treatment of, if there's more accountability put on making sure there's appropriate follow-up of the patients after they get discharged, then you can have, you hold the hospitals accountable for that. And you see this in those areas where they do track readmissions. So if you get sent home with congestive heart failure, you're probably going to get a call from a nurse checking to make sure you're taking your diuretics, keep your fluid load down, you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. There's no follow-up after discharge to the hospital to make sure. So maybe you got 4 days of antibiotics from the hospital pharmacy, and you got sent home with a script for 6 days more to finish off your Vanco. And did the patient fill the script? Are they taking the other 6 days? Are they doing those steps? And I think if they tracked recurrent C. diff readmissions, there would be a lot more impetus to kind of apply those types of quality standards to patients once they leave the hospital.
So I think we have time for one more question.
So it's not so much a question, but
Lori, it's not a question, it's a comment. Nurban has.
I know. I just, the whole issue of death certificates is huge for me because I spent a lot of time on this issue because my mom's death certificate is not accurate either. But my understanding is that there is a department at CDC, the Vital Statistics Department, that oversees the template that goes out to states. And anyone here who knows better, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's true.
But that they have a committee of all experts who design that template. And I asked if a patient advocate could be a member of that committee, and I kept getting passed along, but I think that's central to this issue. And it isn't just about C. diff deaths, it's about many deaths that are not being categorized. And I think the most important implication of this is that it's not getting the funding it deserves. Because when you see that top 10 causes of death that's published on the CDC website, that's not accurate. It could say C. diff, it might say medical errors, but it doesn't because of this issue with death certificates. So it's a huge public health issue. And I can't for the life of me figure out why there isn't more attention to this, considering the implications.
There's no money in it. It's always that there's no money in it, Laura. That's always the answer.
I guess I hold our public health system in higher regard.
I think the people who work in our public health system are amazing, but I think that we are just emerging from 40 years of cutting everything that didn't earn money for somebody out of budgets on the state and federal level, and we have to reverse that. I mean, as we were talking about just a little while ago, 50% of all people who died in hospitals used to be autopsied. They're not, and that's where we learned a great deal about what we know about modern medicine. And they stopped doing that because it exposed them to risk of being sued if they found it was an error caused by the hospital. And they stopped because there's no money in it. You don't get paid to do an autopsy. Yeah, I mean, we could keep going in this direction, but the reality of it is that we have to begin to establish that there are things that you have to spend money to do that don't actually make you any money, like running a nonprofit. So on that happy note, my husband is going to see if we can still afford our trip to Spain next month. So I want to thank you guys so much, and I want to thank such an engaged audience.